Godzilla is back and ready to prove why he's the king of the monsters at movie theaters this weekend. To help celebrate the much-hyped sequel, I want to take a look back at the best and worst Godzilla endings of the 8 and 16-bit eras. This includes Godzilla Monster of Monsters, the movie Monster game, Godzilla 2 War of the Monsters, Super Godzilla, Godzilla Monster War, Godzilla the series, and a whole lot more. Turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the stories and endings for pretty much every Godzilla game released in the 1980s and 90s. This is Game Over, the early years. While Godzilla has had his ups and downs on the big screen, his video game career has mostly consisted of downs. There aren't a whole lot of good Godzilla games out there, especially when we're talking about the early 8 and 16-bit days. But are the endings as bad as the games? That's what we're going to find out in this monster-sized episode of Game Over. Now, because there are so many games to talk about, we're going to have to tackle this in a slightly different way. There's no time to be comprehensive here, so I'm just going to give you the setup and then go straight into the ending. We're also going to skip a lot of the games that don't have a proper ending, or just have a single congratulations screen. That includes some of the earliest games like Godzilla on the Commodore 64, and Godzilla and the Martians on the ZX Spectrum. Unfortunately, this also includes pretty much every Godzilla game released on the MSX, such as Godzilla vs. 3 Major Monsters, Gojira-kun, and Monsters Fair. So let's go ahead and start with the movie Monster game, which may not have been the first appearance of a pixelated Godzilla, but it was the first to offer a proper ending. Granted, it was on the Commodore 64 and Atari 2 computers, so the ending isn't exactly spectacular. But look, we have to start somewhere. There's not much of a story here because this game is really just an excuse to play a bunch of famous movie monsters destroying famous cities and landmarks. Although the game gave us parody versions of the Blob, Transformers, Mothra, and even the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, Epyx was able to officially license Godzilla, which is why he's showing up in this video. Here's what happens when Godzilla is done destroying the Statue of Liberty and Big Ben. For me, my first Godzilla video game was Monster of Monsters on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's not a great game, but it has a badass cover, and I like that you could play as either the God of Destruction or Mothra. Playing as Mothra essentially turned the action into a really terrible side-scrolling shooter. Now eat your heart out, Neil deGrasse Tyson, because this game starts with Pluto and Neptune switching positions in the solar system. This leads to the unveiling of the mysterious planet X, which plans on conquering Earth using an army of space monsters. This sends Godzilla and Mothra into space in an effort to defeat King Ghidorah, Hedorah the Smog Monster, Mechagodzilla, and the rest of your favorite kaiju villains. We eventually get to Planet X, and here is what happens next. 4 years after he visited Planet X, Godzilla returned to the Nintendo Entertainment System in War of the Monsters. This is a big departure that throws out all the side-scrolling action stuff and replaces it with a strategy game. This is actually one of the few Godzilla games to turn the movie monster into, well, a monster. Forget about saving Japan, because the big green lizard joins Rodan, Mothra, Hedorah, and King Ghidorah to stomp all over a few buildings. You play the Allied Defense Forces, a military squad that'll need to use their smarts to defeat these towering bad guys. We throw all our tanks and fighter jets at the problem, and this is what happens next. Now, one thing developers liked to do back in the day was to show you the ending under the credits roll. That's the case with our next two games, Godzilla in the arcade and Godzilla Battle Legends on the TurboDuo. Let's go ahead and start with the Turbo game, which was a pretty straightforward one-on-one fighter starring Godzilla, Rodan, Gigan, Megalon, Super X, Biollante, and a half dozen other popular characters in their various incarnations. This is really just more of an excuse to see your favorite monsters than to tell a proper story, so we're just gonna skip to the end and let the credits roll. So everything I said about that TurboDuo game also applies to the arcade game simply titled Godzilla. This is mostly a one-on-one battle against all your favorite rubber monsters, but there are occasionally bits where you walk around and destroy buildings and stomp on tanks. We eventually have to fight Mothra, who is sometimes good and sometimes bad depending on where the wind blows. Look, Mothra is basically the Catwoman of the Godzilla universe. Anyway, we kick her ass, and this is what happens next. Speaking of fighting games, let's quickly talk about Godzilla Kaijuu Daikessen. This was the Super Famicom sequel to Battle Legends, and a game that was supposed to come out in the United States under the name Destroy All Monsters. Guys, I'm not even going to bother to recap the story because the ending is 10 seconds long. That's not hyperbole, as you'll see for yourself. Now, I know you're probably starting to worry that all of these Godzilla endings are gonna suck. I mean, the last one was 10 seconds long. But fear not, because we're actually building up to a genuinely satisfying conclusion. However, before we get to that, let's first take a look at the Godzilla games released on portable systems. The King of Monsters' first handheld game was simply called Godzilla, and it hit the Game Boy in 1990. This was a port of an MSX game we skipped over and features Godzilla on the hunt to defeat the monsters that kidnapped his son Manila, who is trapped in the labyrinth of Matrix. We find him, and this is what we get for our trouble. Godzilla also roared onto the Game Gear, but he took his sweet time to get there. Godzilla Kaijuu no Daishingeki hit Sega's colorful portable in 1995, towards the tail end of the system's life. Perhaps that's why it didn't come to the United States. In any case, this is a turn-based strategy game like War of the Monsters, only this time around you can play it as either the human defense team or as the big rubber monsters. What's fun is that the scenarios are all based on 5 different Godzilla films, including the 1954 original. Here's what happens when you finally take down Godzilla and save the day. Hey, remember that terrible Godzilla movie from 1998? You know, the one with Matthew Broderick and Leon the Professional? Well, it spawned a short-lived cartoon series that ran for 2 years on Fox Kids. This led to not 1, but 2 Game Boy Color games developed by Crawfish Interactive and published by Crave. Unfortunately, this is the part of the show where I have to throw my hands up in the air and admit that I have no idea what's going on in these games. I've never seen the animated series, and I don't know any of these characters. I mean, they seem to be friends with Godzilla and follow them around as they fight off monsters or something. It ends with Godzilla fighting this facility for some reason, and you know what? Let's just go ahead and cut to the ending. Released 7 months after the cartoon was cancelled, Godzilla the series Monster Wars is a sequel that gives us more of the same. Thankfully, the story's a little easier to follow this time around, even though I still have no idea who any of these characters are or how they're connected to Godzilla. Apparently, aliens have invaded, and they're creating mutants in an attempt to take over the Earth. Now it's up to Godzilla to fight back in order to save the planet from giant monsters. It all leads to a fight against the first Godzilla, who's now equipped with high-tech missile launchers for some reason. Look, this is based on a cartoon. Does it really need to make any sense? Let's just go with it. Here's what happens next. So that brings us to Super Godzilla, the strangest game in this entire series. Unlike most Godzilla games, this is neither a fighting game nor an action game. It's actually more of a maze game, where we steer Godzilla through different levels in an attempt to defeat the bad guys without causing too much damage. The setup is that a bunch of monsters are attacking Japan, and the only solution is to wake up the sleeping lizard to fight back. But can Godzilla be controlled? Well, that's the question we struggle with in this weird 1993 Super NES game. After fighting off the monsters and finally dismantling Mecha King Ghidorah, the humans are surprised to see that there's an even more powerful foe just waiting for his chance to strike. I'm talking about Bagan, who comes down from the sky and literally firebombs the entire city. Don't worry, because the humans have a backup plan, and it involves feeding our hero energy and turning him into Super Godzilla. This sets up an epic fight against Bagan, who shoots energy beams and bites his opponents. We finally get the upper hand, and this is what happens next. Look, these are not good games, so I'm not all that surprised to see that the endings are bad too. Thankfully, they're bad in a lot of different ways. None of them feel satisfying, and it's frustrating that they don't even give us what we're looking for from Godzilla. Let's face it, the developers figured that we were there to see monsters fight, so pretty much everything that came after that is pointless. And I hate to say it, but that's also how a lot of Godzilla movies treated their endings. Hopefully that won't be the case with Godzilla, King of the Monsters. I guess we'll find out this weekend when Earth's champion will defend his title against Rodan, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. I can't wait! Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, The Early Years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every Monday. Now here's the question I have for you. What kind of Godzilla game do you want to play? I doubt it'll ever happen, but I would love to see a huge, destructible open-world battle royale where all the monsters control completely differently. Just a real emphasis on getting the monster controls right. Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we have a packed week ahead of us. We're going to be looking at Coral on the Switch, Zombies in City on Steam, old school Nintendo Power covers, and more. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.